You're welcome to the Messiah channel. We look at end time events and we look at people who matter in the end times. And I believe that God's people matter in the end times. And because of that, we need to awaken God's people. We need to awaken them about their history so that they can put themselves in the prophecies are waiting for them. Prophecies are waiting for people. The prophecies will be coming. They will be fulfilled. But first of all, you need to know your history in the Bible. I think Marcus Garvey said that people who have lost their history, their culture, you can compare them to a tree without roots. That's why it's important for you to know your history. I'm concerned that in the United States, I believe the state of Florida, the governor is trying to ban certain books, trying to prevent the teaching of African history in schools over there. I'm not surprised because even President Trump tried to ban certain books related to the 1619 project. The 1619 project is about the project commemorating the 400-year anniversary of slavery in the United States. So it's imperative to know your history. Somebody wrote a book, The Bible is Black Man's History. He's trying to convey the idea that there are black African presence in the Bible and there are Hebrews in the Bible who are Africans, and you cannot conceptualize anything about your history unless you know your history. And you will know that throughout history, people have tried to distort history, particularly through banning certain books and preventing people to know their history. It happened to the Africans, the Hebrews, who were taken from their ancestral homes to be scattered in all the four corners of the earth. In fact, the Bible was distorted and a new Bible was given to them, the slave Bible. And so today, we are retracing a history, an important history. And we are going to the slave coast in West Africa. They call it the slave coast. The coast from where the Hebrews were taken, kidnapped, captured, taken into ships, and sent to all the four corners of the earth. And when I say we are going to the slave coast, I want you to know that I went to the slave castles in Ghana to do research. I'm talking about 2023, very recent research. And so I'm sharing with you information, the history of the slave castles. I call them castles because they were built as castles for European slave owners slave traders to enjoy. But for those who were enslaved, they were dungeons, slave dungeons. So I would say I went to the slave dungeons in two places, Cape Coast in Ghana and Elimina in Ghana. As you are aware, the Portuguese arrived in the Gold Coast, Elimina, in 1471, and they built a slave dungeon in 1482. So, for the purpose of history, the slave dungeon that the Portuguese built in Elimina in Ghana is the first, the biggest, and the largest in the whole of Africa. It was built in 1482 and became a center for storing slaves, keeping slaves from all over Africa, for them to be shipped initially to the mines in Latin America, and particularly in other places, places like South America, Brazil, and other islands of the sea. So I went there, and I'm just looking at the structures in the slave dungeons or the slave castles, both in Cape Coast and also in Elimina. As I said, the Elimina dungeon was the first to be built in Africa, having been built in 1482. Okay, so I'm looking at few structures that I saw. The first structure I will talk about is the condemned cell. It's a small room with no windows, and as many as 30 people were put in the room. And it was called a condemned cell because if you are put in the room, you are put in the room to die through starvation, because if you are put in the condemned cell, they don't give you food, they don't give you water. And because the condemned cells didn't have any ventilation, there was a lot of heat there. They lock it. They only come to open to see those who are dead. And if you are dead, they take you out and throw you in front in an open space. And those who are still alive, you are kept there until you die. Why do they do that? They do that for two reasons. One, to dehumanize the Negro, and two, to serve as a deterrence. If you're a woman and they want to rape you and you refuse to be raped, you are sent to a condemned cell for you to die. If you resist being enslaved, being changed, if you become recalcitrant, disobedient, you are sent to the condemned cell and you are condemned to death. You'll be starved, no water, no sanitation, and no window. There were cells, male cells and female cells. A cell is a place where the Africans who were enslaved, they were kept They were kept in the cells for about 3 months before being shipped to their destinations, because that was the interval. Africans were kidnapped, captured from all over the continent, whether from Senegal, whether from Cameroon, whether from Angola, whether from Nigeria, and they were sent to the slave castles, serving as a transit point. And those who were so weak and who were not fit, they were left to be taken care by animals, wildlife in the bush, because they were no good. They were not fit. And so it was not profitable to sell them, and you had to throw them in the bush for wild animals to take care of them. And for those who survived, they were kept in the slave cells. Men had their own cells, and women had their own cells. And in the cells, there were no sanitation facilities and very little ventilation. For the women who were in the cells, definitely they were raped. And so it was not unusual to see enslaved African women having babies. Babies from who? From the Europeans. And so in Elmina and Cape Coast, you saw a lot of babies, mulattoes, that's what they called them. You remember that the Europeans who came to the castle, the soldiers, they didn't come with their wives. And so they had to rape the African women and have babies with them. And so if you go to Elmina and Cape Coast, you see people with European names. It is common to see people by the name Van der Poy, Dutch name, McCarthy, English name, and so many other names. So we talk about the condemned cell, where people are sent for them to be starved to death. And we talk about the general cell, where people live with no sanitation, very little ventilation. They are there for 3 months before the ships take them out. So let's talk about the door of no return. If you go to Elmina Castle, the door is not the door at all. It is a small hole that they've punched in a wall, and people rush through that small hole one by one. And it is the last door you pass through. That's why they call it the door of no return. And in Elmina, I observed that the door was so small that only one person can go through the door at a time. And I was told that because the slaves were not fed, they lost weight. And so they will be able to fit into the small hole because they already lost weight. The women in the female cells, according to my investigations, were fed. They were fed once a day. So the door of no return. In the Cape Coast Castle, there's a door of no return. It's bigger. That door is bigger than the door of no return in the Elmina Castle. So once you cross the door of no return, one, you have lost your identity because you are no longer an African. You are no longer a Hebrew. You are a slave. You've lost your identity. You've also lost your name, because once you are packaged to be sent to be sold, you belong to somebody. And so that person has to give you a name. If it's Johnson, your name is not Kunta Kunta. Your name is Johnson. If it's he's Vanderpoy, your name is no longer a Champon. Asante, your name is Vanderpoy. So you lost your name. And the most important thing is that you also lost your ancestors. You are put into a canoe to be shipped, and you are facing the sea. You don't know your destination. You don't know whether you are going to be sent to St. Croix or St. Thomas. You don't know whether you are going to Brazil. You don't know whether you are going to Peru. You don't know where you are going. And you don't know whether you are going to Fort Comfort, Hampton, Virginia. You don't know where you are going. You have crossed the door of no return. Okay, Elmina Castle. Elmina Castle, as I said, is the first to be built in Africa, built in 1482. They were built, according to the Portuguese, to serve as a place to store their goods, and also to be used as a place for, quote unquote, evangelization of the African, evangelism, Christianity. Lo and behold, it was used to serve as a slave center for the whole of the African continent. Okay, so the Cape Coast Castle was built purposely to serve as a slave post. But the Elmina Castle, which was built by the Portuguese, was first built to store goods, but later on, they were used to store another type of goods, human beings, human cargo. Elmina Castle, something strange was observed. I went to a place where it was a balcony, the balcony of the governor. The governor is the head of the European mission in Ghana. And so when the Portuguese had their mission in Ghana, the head of the mission was the governor. And because Ghana was a colony, the head of the mission is the head of the whole country, because Ghana was not independent. And so during the time of the slave trade, the governor at the Elmina Castle, the European, he had a balcony, and you come from his living room or bedroom to stand at the balcony, and you command all the female slaves to be brought outside in an open space. They will bring them from their cells, and he will pick and choose the ones he wanted to rape. And once he spotted the ones he wanted to rape, the soldiers would clean the woman. And I saw a stairway where the woman passed to climb from the floor straight to the governor's living room to be raped. And those who refused to be raped, they were tortured. They were chained to a big steel ball, round ball, very, very heavy. I tried to carry the ball, so very heavy, I couldn't carry it. Sorry. So that is the governor's balcony. It's upstairs. You look at from the balcony, look downstairs and see all the women, different shapes, different sizes, and pick and choose the one you wanted to rape. No resistance at all. I wouldn't say there's no resistance. There were a lot of resistance. Some women refused to be raped, and those who refused were tortured, and some of them were sent to the condemned cells, condemned to death. There were other people who were also condemned to death. If you are sick and you are not going to command any good price, you are commercially dead. You are of no use. You are condemned. And said people were also, they were killed. And some were thrown into the sea. There was a situation where people also decided to commit suicide rather than being sent on the canoes. When they were being sent to the canoes, they were changed like this. 8 people, 4 people, 6 people chained together. I understand that in some cases, somebody would decide to get out of the canoe and throw himself into the sea and die. And because he's chained together with several people, all those people will also be forced to die. Let me repeat. 5 people are chained together, or 6 people are chained together. They are put on the canoe to be sent to the ships. One of them decides that he would rather fall into the sea and die. He wants to commit suicide. But because he's chained together with several people, all the other people may be compelled to also get drowned in the sea. Okay, I also observed a church. The slave dungeons also had a church. Both Elmina Castle or the Mina Dungeon and Cape Coast Dungeon, they had a church. And in Cape Coast, the church was SPG. What is SPG? Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. They had a church. The church was located at the top of the cells where the women were. So you had a church on top preaching about God, and below them were slave cells where women were being raped, where people were being condemned to death. Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And during, based on my research, in in Brazil and other places, the Society for Propagation of the Gospel also had slaves. And so there's something we call branding of slaves. You put something on the slave to show that he belongs to you. And at the Elmina Castle, I saw an equipment that they use to print initials. JJ, James Johnson. You belong to James Johnson. So they print the initial JJ on your breast, if you're a woman, or your hand, or anywhere your body, if you're a man. And I saw the equipment that they used to do that branding at the Elmina Castle. And every ship that conveyed slaves had equipment to do that branding. And based on my research, I also found out that the Society for Propagation of the Gospel also owned slaves. And in the Cape Host Castle, I saw their church. In the Elmina Castle, I also saw a church. And the church was the Dutch Reformed Church. Dutch Reformed Church. They had a church in Elmina Castle. And they were preaching. I think they preached very good, I'm sure. Because I saw a Bible quotation, Psalm 132. Psalm 132, verse 14. Let me see. Let me look at the Psalms again. Psalm 132, verse 14. I saw something written on the top of the door in that church, quote unquote, the Dutch Reformed Church, Elmina Castle. And it was Psalm 132, verse 14. The verse 14 was written in Dutch language. It's still written in Dutch language. And I don't speak Dutch. So let me look at Psalm 132, verse 14. You can read it later on. Psalm 132, verse 14. Psalm 132, verse 14. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. It's very strange. If you read Psalm 132, the Psalm of David is talking about Zion. God has chosen that Zion to be his dwelling place. And the Dutch Reformed Church in Elmina, the slave dungeon, and I believe they were probably deceiving the slaves. The slaves did not choose the slave dungeons to live there forever. By the way, how can a church be located in a place that is also a grave? Because so many people died there. Some Europeans who died, they were buried there. And the Africans who were killed, they were thrown into the sea. So it was a grave. And below the church was also cells, condemned cells, female cells, male cells, places of torture. And they were preaching, quote unquote, the gospel. Psalm 132, verse 14. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it. David will dwell in Zion because he has desired it. The Lord has chosen Zion to be his dwelling place. He had desired it. But the Negro did not choose the slave dungeons to be his dwelling place. He was forced to dwell in the dungeon, to wait 3 and 4 months with no sanitation facilities, no toilets. In some cases, no food. In some cases, no water. Definitely no ventilation. And so this is the history. And I'm telling you the history because my objective is for you to know your history. If you know your history very well, you know that you are in the Bible, you have a presence in the Bible. Something happened, persecution, destruction of Jerusalem. You were forced to flee, and you live in a place, and to fulfill prophecy, you went through all the things that I've gone through because it was prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 28. In the same way, you have to know your history about the scattering. You have to know your history, that your redemption is coming. Because if you know your history very well, you know, based on Isaiah 11:11, that the Messiah is coming to redeem you, to gather you from all the places where you have been scattered to. If you know your history, you have to remember that your God is a holy God. And so you have to be holy. You should not disobey God to go through the judgment that you have gone through 400 years. If you know your history, you know that you are Hebrew and you are priests unto the Lord. And one day you dwell in Zion of the Lord. You will not dwell in a dungeon. You dwell in Zion. You dwell in the holy places. If you know your history, you accept the Messiah, Yeshua Jesus Christ. If you know your history, you will prepare yourself for the last days, because based upon your brother Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 2:44, the Messiah is coming, his kingdom is going to crash. The kingdoms of the heathen nations, including the kingdoms that built the slave dungeons, the Egyptians that you see today, you will not see them anymore. And that is your hope. As you retrieve your history and you put yourself in the holy book and you stand on the promises of God that your redemption draws nigh. Thank you for listening to this message. Know your history, put yourself in the Bible, and do what you're supposed to do. Be holy unto the Lord and abide by his commandments. Thank you for this message.